The apartment is still. She just told me she filed for annulment last week. Signed the paperwork 3 days ago without saying a word. Standing in her stockinged feet in the middle of her living room, my legal wife of 11 weeks is looking at me the way you look at someone when the thing you did to protect them has become the thing you did to hurt them. I am the woman who married her in a witness prep room on a Tuesday in September because there was 1 hour left before the courthouse closed. I have slept in her guest room for 83 nights, and she has just handed me an exit I did not ask for. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The first thing I need you to understand is that Vera and I were not supposed to look this much alike. We had different fathers. We had different last names. Our mother had made an art form out of pointing out the ways in which we were, if you looked closely enough, not the same person, which was an art form she had developed because half the town had spent our childhoods failing to tell us apart, and she had grown tired of correcting them. Vera had a scar on her chin from a bicycle accident at 12. I did not. Vera had her ears pierced twice on the left and once on the right. I had 1 hole in each. Vera dyed her hair a shade lighter than mine, which meant, in most lighting conditions, it looked exactly the same. At 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in September, wearing the dress she had told me to wear so I could stand in the family photos she had already promised her fiancé we would take, my hair the color it had always been, my ears wearing the small gold studs my mother had given me at graduation, I looked, from a distance of 10 feet, through the tinted glass of a county courthouse door, exactly like Vera Callahan. Soline Marchetti had never met Vera in person. I knew this because Vera had told me over dinner 2 weeks ago, laughing in the specific way she laughed when she was telling me something she wanted me to talk her out of, and knew I wouldn't. "It's fine," she had said. "She's paying me $50,000 to be legally married to her for 1 year. Her grandmother's will requires it. She has to sign the paperwork before her 35th birthday, or the whole foundation goes to her cousin. We have a lawyer. There is a prenup. It is the cleanest transaction of my life." I had said, "Vera, what if you fall for her?" Vera had rolled her eyes. Vera had, apparently, fallen for her. Or at least fallen for the specific gravitational weight of the situation she had agreed to. Somewhere between the wine bar and this courthouse, she had lost the ability to walk through those glass doors and had, instead, sent a text. I put the phone away, and I pushed the door open, and I walked into the courthouse lobby. The way you walk into a room when the version of yourself that was going to make the decision has already made it. Soline turned at the sound of my heels on the marble. She was 35 years old, and she looked her age in the specific way that women in navy suits look their age, which is to say, entirely without apology, and with the confidence of a person who has been the most composed woman in every room for at least a decade. Her hair was dark and pulled back at the base of her neck. Her mouth did not smile when she saw me. Her eyes did the small, quick professional cataloging that some women do, the version of eye contact that takes in your face and your posture and your shoes and returns to your face without making it into a compliment. She said, "You are on time." I said, "Vera can't come." She heard the sentence. Then she heard the second thing about it, which was the voice it had been spoken in, which was not the voice she had heard in 3 video calls with the woman she believed was standing in front of her. Her eyes moved to my chin, to the ear on my left, back to my face. She said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Reeve, her sister." Soline did not move. She did not put down the envelope. She did not adjust her posture. Nothing about her face changed except one very small thing that I only caught because I had spent 30 seconds of my life so far looking at her, which was that the muscle beneath her left ear went very still. She said, "We should speak somewhere else." She did not ask any of the questions I would have asked. She did not ask where Vera was. She did not ask why I was here. She did not ask how I had known where to come. She simply picked up her envelope and turned toward the corridor to the left of the lobby, and I followed her, because there was nothing else I was going to do. She opened the 3rd door on the corridor without knocking. It was a witness preparation room, 2 chairs, a table, a window that looked out onto the small square of courtyard the county had planted with unenthusiastic hostas. She closed the door behind us. She set the envelope on the table. She did not sit down. She said, "Tell me exactly what has happened." I said, "Vera texted me 8 minutes ago. She said she can't do it. She said she is sorry. She said the money will be back in your account by tonight." Solene stood very still. She said, "She is not coming." I said, "She is not coming." She looked at the envelope on the table. She looked at me. She looked at the clock on the wall of the witness prep room, which read 3:11, which meant we had 1 hour and 49 minutes before the courthouse closed, and her grandmother's will condition failed, and the family foundation her grandmother had spent 40 years building went to a man who Vera had described, over that same dinner at the wine bar, as a genuinely dangerous human being with a strong sense of entitlement and no particular interest in continuing to fund children's cancer research. Solene said, "I need to sit down." She sat down. I sat down across from her. She did not put her face in her hands. She did not do any of the things a woman in a navy suit might do at a moment like this. She sat with her back straight, and her hands folded loosely in her lap, and she looked at the table, and she absorbed the information the way you absorb the information that a load-bearing wall in your house has been condemned. Quietly, structurally, making the necessary calculations about what the next 24 hours are going to require of you. Then she said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "I did not do this on purpose." She said, "I know. But you could have not come in. You could have read the text on the stairs and turned around. You came in. That was a choice." I looked at her. I said, "You have a foundation to save." She said, "I do." I said, "You have 1 hour and 46 minutes. She said, 1 hour and 45. I said, "What was the plan?" She said, "Which one?" I said, "The one where my sister walks in that door and marries you." Solene looked at the envelope. She said, "We were going to appear before the officiant at 3:30. 2 witnesses waiting upstairs. We were going to sign the license and say the words. The whole thing would have taken 11 minutes. Then Vera was going to stay at my apartment for 2 nights and fly to Barcelona for 6 weeks so a period of geographic separation would look organic. We would appear at 3 functions across the year and quietly file for an uncontested annulment at the end." I said, "That is a very specific plan." She said, "I am a very specific person." She said, "I do not think you are here, because you were the person my sister was sending to break the news to me in a lobby. I think you were coming in for a different reason." I said, "I was going to be the witness in the family photograph. She wanted a picture on the courthouse steps that she could send to our mother." Solene looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise. The registration of a fact she had not accounted for. She said, "Your mother does not know this is a legal arrangement." I said, "Our mother does not know anything about you." Solene said, "Then why the photograph?" I said, "Because Vera is 30, and our mother has spent 5 years asking her when she is going to bring someone home, and Vera thought, in the specific idiocy of Vera, that showing our mother a picture of a beautiful woman in a navy suit at a courthouse would buy her 3 months of peace." Solene said, "She was going to use me as a shield against her mother." I said, "She was going to use you as a shield against her mother and take $50,000 for it." "Yes." Solene almost smiled. Not a real smile. The specific mouth movement of a person absorbing the accurate information about someone she had trusted with a load-bearing decision. She said, "You are angry with her." I said, "I am furious with her." She said, "But you came in." I said, "I came in." She said, "Why?" I looked at her. I looked at Solene Marchetti in the 3rd witness prep room of the county courthouse at 3:15 on a Tuesday in September, in a navy suit that had cost more than 3 of my paychecks combined, with the manila envelope containing her marriage license on the table between us, and I understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only when it is already too late to have arrived any other way, that there was exactly one thing I could do here that was not going to be the wrong thing. I said, "You have 1 hour and 44 minutes. Marry me instead." Solene did not move. The clock on the wall did its small mechanical progress. Somewhere in the corridor outside, two women were talking about something that was not this. She said, "No." I said, "Soline." She said, "You do not even know me." I said, "I do not need to know you. I need to know that your grandmother spent 40 years building a foundation that funds children's cancer research, and that the cousin who inherits it, if you are not married by 5, is a genuinely dangerous human being with an entitlement problem. That is what I need to know. That is all I need to know." She said, "You cannot marry me on the strength of a foundation." I said, "I can marry you on the strength of the fact that I am here, and my sister isn't. That is the entirety of the strength required. The paperwork is already drafted. Your officiant is already booked. Your witnesses are already upstairs. All that changes is the name on the license." Soline looked at me. She said, "You would sign a legal marriage document at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday for a woman you met 11 minutes ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "Reeve." She said my name. She said it the way you say a name when you are trying to see if the person the name belongs to is actually the person sitting across from you, slowly, testing it. It was the first time she had used my name. It was also the first time she had said anything to me in a voice that was not the voice she had been using for the paperwork. There was a difference between how she said Marchetti when she was introducing herself and how she said Reeve when she was looking at me across a table. The first was the version of her voice she used for institutional purposes. The second was a smaller and more careful thing that I had not been prepared for. She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes." She said, "You do not understand what you are agreeing to." I said, "Then tell me." She said, "You are agreeing to 12 months in a legal arrangement with a woman who cannot be your friend or your partner, and to at least 4 public appearances at events full of lawyers who have known me for a decade and will look at you and try to work out what version of my life produced you." I said, "Okay." She said, "Stop saying okay." I said, "I have been thinking about it since I opened the text. I understood what you were asking Vera to do the moment she told me 2 weeks ago, and I have been thinking about all of it, and I am telling you that I have thought about it." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I am here." She said, "That is not a reason." I said, "It is the only reason. Everything else is decoration. I am here. My sister isn't. There is an hour and 43 minutes until the courthouse closes. I look enough like her that your officiant will not blink. I have my own identification, which will go on the license under my own name, which is different from hers, which will change nothing about the legal validity of the ceremony, because the name that matters is the one on the license, not the one on your grandmother's expectations. I am the version of the solution that is standing in this room." Soline looked at me for a very long moment. Then she said, "I need to make one phone call." I said, "Make it." She stood up. She walked to the window. She dialed a number without looking up. When the person on the other end answered, she said, "Margaretha, something has changed. I need you to come down to witness prep room 3. Bring Cass. And I need you to not ask any questions until we are both in the room. Yes, now." She hung up. She stood at the window with her back to me for a moment. She said, "You should call your mother first." I said, "No." She said, "Reeve." I said, "If I call my mother, she will drive to the courthouse and she will stop me, and I do not want to be stopped." Soline said, "Then call her tomorrow." I said, "I will call her tomorrow." She turned around. She said, "The foundation is called the Marchetti Family Foundation for Pediatric Oncology Research. My grandmother died 6 months ago. She left instructions for the foundation to transfer to my control on my 35th birthday, which is at midnight tonight, on the condition that I be legally married by close of business today. My cousin is her only other direct heir. He has spent the last 5 years using shell corporations to strip 4 smaller charitable foundations of their operating budgets. If the foundation transfers to him at midnight, he will dissolve it inside 3 years. That will end the 22 open research grants it currently funds. 2 of those grants are on the verge of publishing findings that will meaningfully change the survival rate for a specific pediatric cancer." I said, "Soline." She said, I am telling you this because you asked me to tell you. I said, I know. She said, I do not want you to marry me because I need it. I want you to marry me because you understand what is being marred if you don't. I said, I understood before you said it. She said, I know you did. I am saying it anyway. The door opened. 2 women came in. The one in front was in her mid-50s, in a black suit and pearls, with the specific bearing of a woman who had negotiated things at a high level for a long enough time to have made peace with the fact that most emergencies were, at their core, just paperwork problems. She looked at Solene. She looked at me. Her eyes did the same small, quick professional cataloging Solene's had done in the lobby. She said, Solene, where is Vera Callahan? Solene said, Vera Callahan is not coming. Margrethe absorbed that in one silent second. Margrethe said, and this is, Solene said, this is Reeve Amaretti, Vera's half-sister. She has agreed to step in. The second woman, who was younger and had a folder tucked under her arm and looked like she had been briefed on the situation 2 hours ago and was now being briefed again on a different situation, said, she has agreed. I said, I have agreed. Margrethe looked at me. She looked at me for one very long, very still second. Then she said, Reeve Amaretti, do you understand the legal instrument you are about to enter into? I said, I do. She said, do you understand that you and Solene Marchetti will be legally married until such time as a formal annulment or divorce is completed? I said, I do. She said, do you understand that the arrangement previously offered to Vera Callahan cannot legally be transferred to you in its original form because the original agreement was with a party who is not you, and any financial compensation to you would need to be renegotiated independently and disclosed as such? I said, I do not need to be paid. Margrethe closed her eyes. Just briefly. It was the smallest closing of the eyes I had ever seen. It was the specific closing of the eyes a 55-year-old attorney does when a 28-year-old woman she has just met has said something that requires the entire situation to be recategorized. She said, Reeve, I am going to say this once. If you enter into a legal marriage without compensation, we cannot later claim there was consideration, and the marriage will not be defensible as a contractual arrangement in any subsequent litigation. From a legal standpoint, we need this to look like a marriage, and marriages, as a rule, do not require consideration. Compensation would actively complicate our position. So if you tell me that you are doing this for reasons that are not financial, that is not a problem. That is, from my position, the cleanest possible version of what has just happened. I said, I am doing this because Solene needs someone to walk through a door with her in 1 hour and 40 minutes. Margrethe looked at Solene. She said, Solene, are you comfortable with this? Solene said, no. Margrethe said, are you willing to proceed? Solene said, yes. Margrethe said, then we should get upstairs. The officiant was a woman in her 60s named Judge Ada Whitfield. She had a very kind face and very tired eyes and the specific patience of a person who had presided over 4,000 civil ceremonies and had learned, over the course of the 4,000, to ask exactly none of the questions she had once asked as a younger woman. She looked at the license. She looked at the 2 names. She looked at me. She said, you are Reeve Amaretti. I said, I am. She said, you are marrying Solene Marchetti this afternoon of your own free will. I said, I am. She looked at Solene. She said, Solene, you are marrying Reeve Amaretti this afternoon of your own free will. Solene said, I am. Judge Whitfield said, you have witnesses. Margrethe raised her hand. Cass raised her hand. Judge Whitfield said, very good. Please stand. This will take approximately 7 minutes. She said the words. They were the words that civil ceremonies use, which are the words that do not pretend to be anything other than the legal instrument they are. There were no rings. There were no vows about better or worse. There was a declaration of intent and a series of statements of legal consequence and a request for our signatures and a formal pronouncement. I said the things I was asked to say. Solene said the things she was asked to say. At the moment when Judge Whitfield asked whether either party had any impediment to the marriage they were entering, Solene's eyes flicked to mine. It was the first time she had looked at me since we had left the witness prep room. It was the specific look of a woman giving me one last opportunity to walk out the door. I did not walk out the door. Judge Whitfield pronounced us married at 3:57 in the afternoon. Nobody clapped. Nobody kissed. Solene shook Judge Whitfield's hand. Margrethe took the license and put it in a folder, and said she would file it with the county before the close of business. Cass texted her supervisor at the foundation to confirm that the marriage had been completed. Solene turned to me. She said, "My car is in the parking garage." I said, "Okay," she said. "I am going to drive you to my apartment. You are going to stay there tonight. Tomorrow we are going to figure out what the next 12 months look like. Is that acceptable?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Reeve." I said, "What?" She said, "Thank you." I said, "You can say that once. You cannot say it twice." She almost smiled. Not a real smile. The specific mouth movement of a woman who had spent an afternoon absorbing several impossible pieces of information and was still functioning. She said, "Understood." Her car was in the parking garage on the second level. She had walked me down from the third floor without speaking. Margrethe had walked with us to the elevator and had said, quietly, "I will call you tomorrow morning," and touched Solene's elbow briefly the way a woman who has known another woman for a long time touches her. Neither of us spoke in the elevator. The garage was quiet. She unlocked the car with a fob. She put her manila envelope on the back seat and her hands on the wheel. She did not start the car. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am legally married to a woman I met at 3:11 this afternoon." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am not okay in the sense that any reasonable person would identify as okay. I am okay in the sense that I made a decision and I stand by it, and I am not going to spend the drive to your apartment second-guessing it." She said, "That is a functional definition." I said, "It is going to have to be." She started the car. She backed out of the space with the same clean economy she brought to everything. She drove up the ramp of the garage. She merged onto the street. She stopped at the first red light. She rested her hands on the wheel at exactly 10:02 and did not look at me. I looked at her hands. She was wearing a thin gold band on her right hand that had not been there in any of the video calls Vera had described to me. It was on her right hand. It was not a wedding ring. I said, "Whose ring is that?" She said, "My grandmother's." I said, "You wore it today." She said, "I wore it today." The light turned green. She drove. She drove me to her apartment. It was a 12-minute drive across the river to the specific part of the city where women like Solene Marchetti lived, which was a neighborhood of pre-war buildings with limestone facades and doormen who did not ask questions. She parked in an assigned space in the underground garage. She led me to an elevator that required a key card. She pressed the top button. The apartment was on the 14th floor. It was corner. It had 2 exposures. It had the specific quality of light that only exists in apartments where someone has actually thought about where the windows go. It was not overly decorated. It was clean and warm and lived in by exactly one person. Solene set her keys in a small blue ceramic bowl by the door. She said, "The guest room is on the right. At the end of the hallway. There is an ensuite bathroom. There are towels in the linen closet. There is a robe on the back of the door." I said, "Solene." She stopped. She turned. I said, "What do we do now?" She looked at me for a long time. In the afternoon light coming through her 14th floor windows, with her navy suit still on and her hair still pulled back at the base of her neck and the manila envelope still under her arm, she looked like a woman who had spent 47 minutes being legally married and had not yet found the version of herself that knew how to be that. She said, "We eat something. We drink water. We sit in different rooms until neither of us is running on adrenaline anymore. Then we have a conversation." I said, "Okay." She said, "Reeve." I said, "What?" She said, "Take off your shoes. My grandmother's rule." I looked down at my shoes. Small heels. The ones I had put on this morning because Vera had told me to look nice for the photograph on the steps. I took them off. I set them by the door. Solene did the same with hers. She was shorter than I had realized. In her heels, she had been almost my height. In her stockinged feet on the wide plank floor of her apartment, she was 2 inches shorter than me and looked less like a lawyer and more like a woman. She said, "There is bread in the kitchen, cheese in the drawer, wine in the rack by the counter. Help yourself." Then she walked down the hallway to what I assumed was her bedroom and closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my legal wife's apartment for 1 long minute. I looked at the apartment I had just entered. Wide plank oak floors worn smooth in the paths a single person walks. 3 plants near the windows, well cared for. Books everywhere. Case law, poetry. A biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg with the spine cracked in the middle. There were exactly 2 framed photographs on the whole visible surface of the apartment. One was of an older woman with dark hair pulled back at the base of her neck, standing on a beach. The other was of 2 women in their late 50s, sisters by the look of them, standing in front of a red door. This was, in every specific detail, the apartment of a person who had lived alone for a long time. I walked to the kitchen. I found the bread. I found the cheese. I found a glass. I did not open the wine. I drank water. I sat at the small table by the kitchen window and I looked at the city and I tried to make my body catch up to what my body had done in the last 2 hours. At 6:12, my phone rang. It was Vera. I did not answer. At 6:14, my phone rang. It was Vera. I did not answer. At 6:16, Vera texted, "Reeve, please pick up." I called her back. She said, "Reeve, what did you do?" I said, "You know what I did." She said, "Margarethy called me at 4:10. She said the paperwork had been signed. She said the foundation transfer will process at midnight. She said, and I am quoting her, 'Your sister has handled the situation with grace, and I will not be involved in whatever happens next.'" I said, "Yes." She said, "Reeve." I said, "Vera, you bailed." She said, "I know." I said, "You bailed at 7 minutes before 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday." She said, "I know." I said, "You bailed because you had spent 3 weeks meeting her in person and figured out that $50,000 was not enough to walk into a room and legally marry a woman you had actually met." Vera did not say anything. I said, "You were falling for her, and rather than tell her, you sent a text and asked me to convey your apologies." Vera said, "I did not ask you to marry her." I said, "You asked me to walk in the door." Vera was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am in her apartment. She is in her bedroom. I am at her kitchen table. I am legally married. I am okay in the specific way that you are okay when you have done something you would do again." Vera said, "Reeve." I said, "Vera." She said, "She is not the woman I told you she was." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" "You have known her for 3 hours." I said, "I know because you would not have been unable to walk in the door if she had been the woman you told me she was. I know because Solene Marchetti does not use people. She survives them. And you figured that out in week 2 and could not tell me, because telling me would have required you to tell yourself, and you were not going to tell yourself. So you did the version of what you were going to do, which was to send a text and pass the whole situation off to the sister who has been fixing your situation since we were 9. Vera said, "That is not fair." I said, "It is not fair. It is also accurate." Vera did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "You are going to be a better wife to her than I would have been. I am not saying that as a compliment to you. I am saying that as a diagnosis of me." She said, "Tell her the money is going to the foundation directly. She will understand." I said, "I will tell her." Vera said, "Do not fall for her." I said, "Good night, Vera." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table in my legal wife's apartment and looked at the phone in my hand and thought about the fact that my sister, who had spent 3 weeks in the actual company of Solene Marchetti and had been unable to walk through a door for reasons that were now, in retrospect, entirely legible, had felt it necessary to warn me not to fall for her. I had known her for 3 hours. I put the phone face down on the table. At 7:30, Solene came out of her bedroom. She had changed clothes. She was in dark jeans and a soft cream-colored sweater, and her hair was down. It was longer than I had realized when it was pulled back. It fell to the middle of her back in a thick dark wave that was, in this light, almost warm. She stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. She said, "Have you eaten anything?" I said, "Bread and cheese." She said, "That is not eating." She moved to the refrigerator. She opened it. She took out 3 things. She set them on the counter. She began to cook, with the same clean economy she had used for everything else all afternoon, and I sat at the kitchen table and watched her make a pasta dish that took her 19 minutes from start to finish and required, apparently, exactly the amount of attention necessary to keep her from looking at me. She set 2 plates on the table. She sat across from me. She said, "Vera called." I said, "Yes." She said, "What did she say?" I said, "She said the money is going directly to the foundation. She said you would understand what that meant." Solene said, "I do." I said, "She said she was sorry." Solene said, "I know." I said, "She also said she was falling for you and could not do it," which she did not say directly, but which was the shape of everything she said. Solene picked up her fork. She set it down. She looked at me for a long moment across the table. She said, "I am going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly." I said, "Okay." She said, "When you walked into the courthouse at 3:11 this afternoon, did you already know you were going to offer to marry me?" I looked at her. I said, "No." She said, "When did you decide?" I said, "I decided in the witness prep room when you told me the officiant was booked for 3:30. Somewhere in that sentence." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you were about to lose your grandmother's foundation and my sister had bailed on you, and there was a version of the situation where I could fix it and I could not think of a reason not to." Solene looked at her plate. She said, "That is a very Vera answer." I said, "It is a very Reeve answer. Vera does not fix situations. Vera creates situations that other people fix." Solene said, "I am learning that." I said, "I am sorry it took a courthouse." She said, "It is not your job to be sorry for her." I said, "I know." She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes." She said, "Tomorrow morning we will have a real conversation. Tonight we will eat this and we will drink water and we will go to sleep in different rooms and we will not try to construct any more of this than we have already constructed. Is that acceptable?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." We ate. The pasta was good in the specific way that food is good when a person who has made peace with cooking for exactly one person for a long time has to double the recipe and finds she still remembers how. The kitchen was warm. The city outside her 14th floor windows moved through its late September evening, unaware that a courthouse, 2 neighborhoods over, had produced a legal marriage between 2 women who had known each other for 4 hours and were sitting at a kitchen table pretending, both of them, that we knew how to do this. At some point during the meal, she asked what I did. I said, "I am a landscape designer. I work for a small firm that does residential work in the neighborhoods south of the river. I am second in a firm of 6. She said, "You went to school for that." I said, "I did. Botanical horticulture and design, State University, undergraduate, no graduate degree." She said, "You are good at it." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you sat down at a table in a room with a woman in a navy suit 40 minutes ago and looked at the plants by her window and clocked which one had been overwatered." "I watched you do it," I said. "The peace lily." She said, "Yes, which is my grandmother's. It came with the apartment when I inherited it. I have been overwatering it for 6 months and did not know how to stop." I said, "I can look at it tomorrow." She said, "That would be a kindness." We finished eating. At 10 she stood. She cleared her plate. She stopped by my chair on the way to the sink and, for one very small and completely accidental second, her hand brushed the back of my chair. Just the back of the chair. Not me. Not even close to me. The wood of the chair back, an inch from my shoulder. She said, "Good night, Reeve." I said, "Good night, Soline." She walked down the hallway. She closed her bedroom door. I sat at the kitchen table for another 20 minutes. I finished my water. I stood. I turned off the light. I walked down the hallway to the guest room, past the closed bedroom door, and I could not tell whether the light was on behind it because the seam beneath the door was too tight to leak. I closed the guest room door behind me. I sat on the edge of the guest bed. I looked at my hands. I still had my mother's small gold studs in my ears. I still had, on my left hand, the ring my grandmother had left me, which was the plainest of plain silver bands and which was, at approximately 4 p.m. today, the closest thing to a wedding ring that had been on my hand when I had signed a document that made me legally the wife of a woman in the room down the hall. I lay down. I did not sleep. Somewhere down the hallway, my legal wife was also not sleeping. I could not have said how I knew. I could not have said what the specific quality of a silent apartment tells you about the woman on the other side of a closed door. But I knew. She was awake. She was doing what I was doing, which was staring at a ceiling in the specific late September dark of a 14th floor bedroom in a city where nothing had, 4 hours ago, been legally binding between us. And now everything was. At 2 a.m, I heard her bedroom door open. I heard her walk down the hallway to the kitchen. I heard her fill a glass with water. I heard her stand at the kitchen window for a long time, not moving, just standing. Then I heard her walk back down the hallway. She stopped outside my door. She stood there for one long held breath of a moment. She did not knock. She walked back to her room. She closed her door. I lay in the guest bed in my legal wife's apartment and I understood, in the specific way you understand a thing, at 2 a.m. on the first night of a marriage neither party expected to be inside of, that my sister had been right to warn me, and that the warning had come approximately 6 hours too late. I fell asleep sometime after 4. I woke at 7:40. The apartment had the specific quiet of a building whose walls had been built when walls were expected to keep noise inside them. There was, faintly, the sound of coffee. There was, faintly, the sound of a woman moving through a kitchen with the small, deliberate quietness of a person who was aware that she had a guest. I sat up. I had slept in the dress from the courthouse because I had no clothes with me. I had taken the studs out of my ears at some point in the last 4 hours. I did not remember doing it. They were on the nightstand. I washed my face in the ensuite bathroom. The soap smelled like something I could not identify. Cedar, a little citrus, expensive in the specific way that soaps in the bathrooms of women like Soline Marchetti are always expensive, which is to say quietly. I put on the robe on the back of the door. I walked to the kitchen. Soline was at the counter with a coffee in her hand. She was in the same soft cream sweater she had worn to bed. Her hair was still down. She had, I noticed, not slept much either. There was the specific tiredness around her eyes that comes from being awake at hours that most people do not use. She looked up when I came in. She said, "There is coffee." I said, "Thank you." She poured me a cup. She did not ask how I took it. She set it on the counter. She turned to the window and looked out. I picked up the cup. She had made it black, which was how I took it, which was information she should not have had. I said, "You noticed how I drink coffee." She said, "You picked up a cup at the diner across from the courthouse yesterday when you came in with Vera 2 weeks ago." I said, "I did not see you there." She said, "I was 2 tables over." I had come to look at the woman I was going to marry. I ended up looking at both of you. I set the cup down. I said, "Soline." She said, "I know. That is a thing I should not have done and did not tell you about. I am telling you now, because I am not going to spend the next 12 months maintaining information I have chosen not to disclose. If you and I are going to do this, I need to do it the way I would have if there had been time to prepare." I said, "You watched us for how long?" She said, 40 minutes, until you both left. I paid for my coffee and left 20 minutes after you did. I said, "You were checking to see if she could do it." She said, I was checking to see if I could. She turned back around. She looked at me across the counter. In the morning light, without the navy suit and without the pulled-back hair, she looked like a person and not a lawyer, and the difference between the two versions of her was something I was still learning how to hold. She said, "I did not know you were her sister at that time. I noticed you because you were with her. I noticed that she talked at you for most of the 40 minutes and that you listened to about half of what she said. I remember thinking that I hoped Vera had someone in her life who talked to her the way she had talked at you. And now I know it is you. And now I am the woman standing in a kitchen with you, and I do not know how to hold the information I noticed about you 2 weeks before I met you." I did not know what to say to that. I said, "You should not have told me." She said, "I know." I said, "Because you have made it harder to have breakfast with you." She said, "I know that too." I picked up the coffee again. I took a sip. The coffee was very good. It was the coffee of a person who had thought about coffee more than most people, in the same way the apartment was the apartment of a person who had thought about apartments. I said, "We should talk about the next 12 months. She said, "Yes." She moved to the small table by the window. She sat. I sat across from her. She said, "You have a job." I said, "I do." She said, "You have your own apartment." I said, "I do. 6 blocks from Vera. I have lived there for 4 years." She said, "You have a life." I said, "I do." She said, "Nothing about this arrangement requires you to give up your life. You do not have to live here. What you have to do is 4 public appearances with me over the year. You will be listed as my spouse on my tax filings and the foundation's disclosure forms. Otherwise, you can continue to be Reeve Amoretti, landscape designer, and I will continue to be Solene Marchetti." I said, "Where do I sleep tonight?" She said, "In your own bed, in your own apartment. I will drive you home when you are ready." I looked at her. I said, "That is not what I meant." She looked at the table. I said, "I meant, for the record of a marriage which will at some point be examined by a court that needs to believe it was real, where do I sleep tonight?" She said, "Reeve." I said, "You told me last night that we would have to appear as married to lawyers who have known you for a decade, which means the arrangement has to have a plausible surface, which means we cannot spend 12 months living in 2 different apartments, in 2 different neighborhoods, because the first person who checks the address on the tax return is going to know." She said, "You have thought about this." I said, "I have been thinking about it since the elevator." She said, "Reeve." I said, "I do not need to be paid. I do not need a role. I need a room in this apartment for 12 months, so that when someone checks, and someone will check, the 2 of us have been living in the same building. That is the thing I am telling you I need for this to hold." She looked at the table for a long moment. She said, "You would live here." I said, "I would keep my apartment. I would live here. My mail would come here. My driver's license would be updated to reflect this address. I would sleep in the guest room. For 12 months, she said, "That is more than the arrangement." I said, "The arrangement was $50,000 for a woman who was not going to be in the room. You do not have that woman anymore. You have me. And what I am telling you is that if we are going to do this, we are going to do it in a way that will survive the specific scrutiny your cousin is going to bring to it." She said, "You know about my cousin." I said, "You told me about him yesterday." She said, "Yes." She looked at the peace lily. She looked at me. She said, "All right." I said, "All right." She said, "But you keep your apartment, the lease, the address on your professional cards, everything. If at any point in the 12 months you decide that this is not something you want to do, you go home. You do not owe me anything." I said, "Solene." She said, "Reeve." I said, "I am going to keep the apartment, and I am also telling you that if I decide in the next 12 months that this is not something I want to do, I will not do the version where I leave without telling you. That is not who I am." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "Understood." That was Wednesday morning. By Friday, I had moved a suitcase into the guest room and had gone back to my apartment and packed a second suitcase and had told my landlord I would be staying with a family member for the year and had asked her to accept the rent on autopay and to text me if the pipes did the thing they did in January. By the following Wednesday, my mail was being forwarded. By the second Wednesday of October, my driver's license had my new address on it. We did not talk about any of this in the mornings. The mornings established themselves quickly. Solene woke at 6, made coffee at 6:10, and was in her office by 8. I woke at 7, drank the coffee she had left in the pot, and took the bus to my firm at 8:45. Neither of us said good morning. Neither of us said goodbye. It was the specific version of coexistence two women arrive at when both of them have lived alone long enough to know that not every morning has to be handled. The evenings were different. The evenings were where the marriage that was not a marriage became a specific thing that neither of us had a word for. We ate dinner together most nights, not because we had agreed to, because Solene cooked at 7:30, and I came home at 7, and the kitchen was where you were when you were in the apartment at that hour. And so we ate. She was, it turned out, a good cook. Not in the way people who take cooking classes are good cooks. In the way a woman whose grandmother had made her chop garlic every Sunday for 20 years is a good cook, efficient, clean, loyal to a small number of recipes she trusted. I did the dishes. She never asked me to. I did them because she cooked, and my mother had raised me, and the arrangement of who does what in a kitchen is one of the things adults do not need to negotiate. She noticed the first week that I did the dishes. She stopped putting them in the sink for me. She started drying them and putting them away. By the third week, we had a kitchen. The piece Lily lived. I moved it 2 feet to the left on the second morning. I told her to water it on Wednesdays instead of Sundays and to give it more light. Within a week, it had a new leaf. Within 3 weeks, it looked like a plant that had remembered it was a plant. She did not thank me. She looked at it in the mornings for a long time. I said, "You are welcome." She said, "I did not thank you." I said, "You looked at it for 4 minutes this morning. That was the thank you." She almost smiled. Not a real smile. The specific mouth movement of a woman who was learning that being caught paying attention was a thing she could survive. The first public appearance was in the third week of October, a foundation gala, 200 people at a hotel downtown, black tie. I did not own a black tie dress. I told Solene this on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, a package arrived. Inside the package was a dark green dress in my size, from a store I could not have afforded, in a color I would have chosen if I had known where to buy it. I said, "Solene." She said, "Return it if you do not like it." I said, "You bought me a dress." She said, "I bought a piece of the arrangement. It is a business expense." "It is on the foundation card. Margrethe expensed it. You are the wife of the foundation chair. There are optics." I said, "Solene." "It is exactly the dress I would have picked." She said, "I know." I said, "How?" She said, "Because I have been living with you for 3 weeks and I have been paying attention. And there is a green wool blanket on the foot of your bed that you brought from your apartment, and I noticed it when you were unpacking, and it is the exact color you look best in. So I bought you a dress that color." I looked at her. She said, "Return it if it is too much." I said, "It is not too much." She said, "Good." I wore it to the gala. She wore a suit, the color of deep charcoal that made her look like a person who had been born in it. We stood together for a photograph before we went inside. She put her hand at the small of my back. She did it with the specific care of a woman who understood that the hand at the small of the back of a wife at a foundation gala was the entire point of the photograph and needed to look inevitable and effortless, and the way it had looked for years. And she succeeded, and I understood, standing there with her hand touching me for the first time since we had signed the license, that we were not going to be able to pretend for 12 months that this arrangement was not going to teach both of us something neither of us wanted to know. Inside, she introduced me to 17 people. Each of them looked at me for a beat too long. Each of them decided, in that beat, to be gracious. Soline had the specific reputation of a woman who did not lie, and the room accepted that there was something they had not been told. The old man who ran the foundation's board took my hand and looked at Soline and said, "She looks like she has stayed up half the night at that kitchen table you love." Soline said, "She has." He laughed and moved on. We drove home at 11. In the car, she said, "Thank you." I said, "You said thank you yesterday." She said, "I know." I said, "You can say it once, you cannot say it twice." She said, "I have said it twice." I said, "Yes." She looked at me from the driver's seat. In the light coming off the tunnel we were driving through, her face was doing a version of composure that was less controlled than the version she had worn to the gala. She said, "I know." We did not talk for the rest of the drive. In November, Vera came to the apartment. She had been back from Barcelona for a week. She had asked to come. Soline had said yes, because Soline did not close doors that were still functionally open, and Vera had shown up on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of wine she had brought from Spain, and a small ceramic bird, she said, had reminded her of the balcony of the apartment where she had been staying. The three of us sat in the living room for 2 hours. It was less awkward than I had expected and more painful than I had prepared for. Vera and Soline talked about Barcelona and about my father, whom Vera had briefly met 3 years ago before he died, and about the specific quality of the wine she had brought. Vera asked Soline how the foundation transfer had processed. Soline answered without any warmth and without any coldness, and it was the specific tone of a woman who had been treated poorly by the sister of the woman she was married to and had decided to conduct herself with the same professional care she brought to depositions. At the end of the 2 hours, Vera stood. She said, "Thank you for having me." Soline said, "Of course." Vera said, "Reeve." I stood. I walked her to the door. In the hallway outside the apartment, with the door closed behind us, Vera looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You are in love with her." I said, "Vera." She said, "I am not asking, I am observing." I said, "I am not." She said, "You are. You have been for 6 weeks. I could see it from the moment I sat down." I said, "Vera." She said, "I am not saying this to make it worse. I am saying this so that you know that I know, and so that the next time we see each other I do not have to pretend I do not know." I said, "It is not something I am going to act on." She said, "Reeve," I said. She would leave the arrangement if she thought I had gone soft on it. She has told me that in 3 different ways, so I am not going to act on it. I am going to be her wife inside the contract for 10 more months and file the annulment paperwork at the end and walk out. Vera said, "You are wrong about her. You think she is protecting herself. She is not. She is protecting you. And she will keep protecting you until you tell her she does not have to." I said, "Vera, I am not talking about this with you." She said, "Okay." She kissed me on the cheek. She left. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I went back inside. Soline was in the kitchen, washing the wine glasses. She said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You are lying." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you want to tell me what she said?" I said, "No." She said, "All right." She dried the glasses. She put them back on the shelf. She looked at me across the counter with an expression I could not read. She said, "Go to bed." I went to bed. I lay in the guest bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the specific quality of Vera's face in the hallway. She had not been wrong. She had not been wrong about any of it. And she had not been wrong about the shape of what I was going to do, which was to spend the next 10 months being the specific version of Soline Marchetti's wife, the arrangement required, and to keep the version of me that was in love with her, locked in the guest room with the door closed. That was in November. By December, I had learned the specific sound of Soline walking to the kitchen at 2 in the morning to get water. She did this maybe twice a week. She had stopped stopping outside my door after the first month, which I had noticed and had chosen not to be sad about. I understood, from the fact that she had stopped, that she had made a decision. I understood that the decision was the correct decision. I lay in bed on the nights I heard her walk, and I did not open the door, and I did not go out. In December, her cousin called. Podcourse. She took the call in her bedroom for 40 minutes. When she came out, her face was the specific version of blank it did when the composure was working hardest. She said, "Marius wants to have lunch. With both of us." I said, "No." She said, "He has retained counsel. He is challenging the will condition on the grounds that the marriage does not appear legitimate. The alternative is a deposition. I would prefer the lunch." I said, "When?" She said, "Wednesday." I said, "All right." She said, "Reeve." I said, "What?" She said, "He is going to try to make you say something that will hurt the marriage." I said, "I know." She said, "You do not have to do this." I said, "I do have to do this. This is the specific thing the marriage exists to survive. If I do not sit across a table from your cousin and make him believe that this is real, then everything we have done since September is decoration. So I am going to have lunch with him on Wednesday." She said, "Reeve." I said, "Soline, I am going to have lunch with him." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Okay." Wednesday came. We had lunch at a restaurant Marius had chosen, because it was a restaurant that people who worked in the same building he worked in went to for lunch. He was 42. He was in a suit that was not as good as Soline's. He had the specific bearing of a man who had spent his adult life believing that his cousin had been given something that should have gone to him, and had constructed, around that belief, an elaborate legal apparatus for retrieving it. His attorney sat next to him. His attorney was a woman named Elise Kellerman, who Margarethy had briefed us on the previous evening. Soline sat beside me. She did not put her hand on the small of my back. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at her cousin with the specific level attention she brought to depositions. I sat beside her in a soft cream-colored sweater and dark jeans that Soline had picked out for me 2 nights ago because Margarethy had said, "Wear the version of yourself you would wear on a Sunday. We want him to see the wife." Marius said, "Soline, it has been a while." Soline said, "It has." Marius said, "I understand congratulations are in order." Soline said, "Thank you." Marius looked at me. He looked at me for one long beat too long. Then he said, "I am sorry we have not met before." I said, "We have not been in the same room until this one." He said, "You must be Soline's wife." I said, "I am." He said, "How did you meet?" I said, "At the courthouse." Everyone at the table went very still. Soline did not turn to look at me. Marguerite, who had come to observe from a table across the restaurant, closed her eyes. I said, "In September." I was standing on the steps, and she was walking in, and we ended up in the same witness prep room. I said this without smiling, in the specific flat voice of a woman giving him exactly enough of the truth that the lie he was constructing became structurally unstable. Marius said, "You met on the courthouse steps." I said, "In the lobby." He said, "And you were married that afternoon." I said, "I was." He said, "That is a very fast marriage." I said, "We had known each other for less time than most married couples have." That was true. It was also enough time. I do not know how to describe to you the specific difference between the amount of time 2 people need to fall in love and the amount of time 2 people need to know they will not stop being in love. Soline knew the second one before we knew the first one. And I am here to tell you that she was right. I said this to a man who had come to lunch to end my legal marriage. I said it in the voice of a woman who was telling the truth. Because it was the truth. I had known it since October. I had known it since the dress. I had known it since the peace lily. Marius said nothing for a long moment. His attorney reached for her water glass with the specific delicacy of a woman who was recalibrating the entire strategy of the meeting. Soline turned her head. She looked at me. It was the first time she had looked at me during the entire lunch. Her face was doing something I did not have a name for. I looked back at her. I did not look away. Marius said, "Soline." Soline said, "Marius." He said, "You know what I am here for." She said, "I do." He said, "And this is your position." She said, "This is my position." He said, "All right." He picked up his fork. He returned to his salad. His attorney did not say anything for the rest of the meal. Solene ate her lunch with the specific care of a woman who had decided that the version of the meal that was going to happen was the version where she ate her lunch. I did the same. At the end of lunch, Marius said, "I will discuss this with counsel." Solene said, "Do that." We walked out. In the parking garage, Solene did not start the car for a long moment. Then she said, "You lied to my cousin about the shape of our marriage in front of his attorney, and my attorney, and a room full of people, and you did it in a voice that made every person at that table believe you." I said, "I did not lie." She said, "Reeve." I said, "I did not lie." She turned to look at me in the specific cold light of the parking garage, with her hands still on the wheel and the car not started, doing the calculation about what to do next, with the care she brought to the calculations that mattered. She said, "We should go home." She started the car. She drove home. She did not speak on the drive. I did not speak on the drive. She parked in her assigned space. She led me to the elevator that required a key card. She pressed the top button. In the elevator, standing next to me in the specific proximity of a person who had been standing next to me in elevators for 11 weeks, she said nothing. The elevator opened. She unlocked the apartment door. She held it. I walked in. She closed it. She took off her shoes. She set them by the door. She hung her coat. She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to know that what you did at that lunch may have saved the foundation. But it also required you to say something out loud that has now been said, and I am not going to pretend I did not hear you." I said, "I know." She said, "So I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Was it a strategy?" I said, "No." She said, "Was it a truth?" I said, "Yes." She looked at the floor. She looked at the peace lily. She said, "Reeve." I said, "Solene, I know you are going to try to protect me from this. You are going to say that I have been in this apartment for 11 weeks and I have not seen you in a normal light and I have confused proximity for something else. You are going to say that I do not owe you anything more than I have already given, and that if I have started to feel something, you are not willing to be the reason. You are going to say all of that in the next 90 seconds and I am asking you to not say it." She looked up at me. She said, "You know what I was going to say." I said, "I know, because I have been living with you for 11 weeks, which is not enough time to know a person. But it is enough time to know how a specific person walks toward a door she does not want to open." She said, "Reeve." I said, "Say the version that is honest instead." She looked at me for a very long moment. In the afternoon light coming through her 14th floor windows, in her stockinged feet on the wide plank oak floor of the apartment I had spent 11 weeks not knocking on her bedroom door in, she looked like the woman I had met in a witness prep room in September. And she looked like the woman who had cooked me pasta on the first night, and she looked like the woman who had bought me a dark green dress, the color of a wool blanket, and she looked like all of them at once. And the composition she was holding was not the composition of a lawyer. It was the composition of a person who had run out of the language she had been using to keep herself unspoken. She said, "I filed for annulment last week." The apartment went very still. She said, "Margaretha drafted the paperwork. It is on her desk. I have not signed it yet. I was going to sign it after the meeting with my cousin, because I thought, after the meeting, one of two things would be true. Either you would have said something that made it clear you were still inside the arrangement, in which case I would have needed you to be out of it before I could sit at a kitchen table with you for another day. Or you would have said something that made it clear you were not inside the arrangement anymore, and I would have needed to sign the annulment paperwork so that whatever came after would not be inside the shape of a contract." I said, "Solene." She said, "Both versions ended with the annulment." I said, "You were going to end the arrangement." She said, "I was going to end the arrangement." "Yes." I said, "Without telling me." She said, "I was going to tell you tonight." I said, "You were going to tell me tonight that you had filed paperwork last week." She said, "Yes." I said, "Solene, that is the specific thing you are not allowed to do." She said, "I know." I said, "You are the woman who told me in September that we were going to do this in the way we would have done it if we had had time to prepare. And then in December you filed paperwork you did not tell me about." She said, "I know." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I could not sit across from you at a kitchen table for another day inside a contract that was going to end in 10 months. Because every night I have walked past the guest room and thought about the woman inside of it, and every night I have decided that the version of me you deserved was the one who kept walking. And because the only way I knew to become the version of me who would not be a lawyer in this specific situation was to sign the paperwork that ended the specific situation." I said, "So you are going to end the marriage in order to be honest with me?" She said, "Yes." I said, "That is the most Solene Marchetti thing you have ever done." She said, "I know." I said, "You did not think to ask me first." She said, "Asking you first would have required me to say all of this to you before I had done any of the work of making sure the arrangement was not the reason you would say yes. And I did not want you to say yes because of the arrangement. I wanted you to say yes because you wanted to." I said, "Solene." She said, "I know." I said, "Sign the paperwork." She looked up at me. I said, "Sign the paperwork. Take the arrangement off the table. Then have the conversation you were going to have with me tonight." She said, "Reeve." I said, "Sign it. Then say it." She walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where she kept the paperwork she had brought home from the office. She opened the folder. The annulment forms were on top. She picked up a pen. She signed them. She said, "Filed effective tomorrow morning." I said, "Okay." She said, "We are, until tomorrow morning, still legally married. After tomorrow morning we are not." I said, "Okay." She said, "Sit down." I sat down. She sat across from me. She said, "I noticed you at the diner in September. I noticed you again in the witness prep room, and I noticed you every day since. I noticed you when you moved the peace lily. I noticed you when you fell asleep on the couch in October reading a book about wetland restoration. I noticed you when you came home from work in November and stood at the sink for a full minute because your day had been hard." She said, "I did not act on it because I was your legal wife and every conversation we had was inside the container of a contract you had signed on my behalf. So I signed the paperwork. And now I am telling you." She said, "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since sometime in October. I do not know the specific day, but I know I did not have the words for it in September, and I had them by the second week of November. And by the time you sat down at that lunch today and said what you said about the difference between the time it takes two people to fall in love and the time it takes them to know they will not stop, I had known you were saying something true about me for 6 weeks, and I could not respond to it inside the arrangement. So I ended the arrangement, and now I am responding to it." She said, "You do not have to say anything back." I looked at her. I said, "You did the annulment because you did not want me to feel obligated." She said, "Yes." I said, "You told me all of that because you decided the honest version was worth the risk of what happens next." She said, "Yes." I said, "Solene." She said, "Yes." I stood up. I walked around the table. I stopped in front of her chair. She looked up at me. I said, "I am in love with you." She closed her eyes. I said, "I have been in love with you since October, since the peace lily, since the dress, since the moment in the parking garage when I understood you were going to try to protect me from you and I was going to have to make you stop." I said, "I did not tell you because I knew what you would do. You would end it. You would give me an exit. So I did not tell you. I decided to spend 10 more months in this apartment being your wife inside a contract because I would rather spend 10 months in a contract with you than 1 week outside of one without you." I said, "But you signed the paperwork." She said, "I signed the paperwork." I said, "Then get up." She stood up. I touched her jaw. I looked at her mouth. Then I kissed her. Not fast, not desperate, patient. the way something is patient when it has waited 11 weeks. She kissed me back briefly, and then she stepped back. She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be very clear about what I am asking for." I said, "Be clear." She said, "I am asking to stay married to you." I looked at her. I said, "You signed the annulment." She said, "I signed the annulment because the marriage we had needed to end. I am asking about the one that comes after it." I said, "Solene." She said, "I do not want to renew the arrangement. I want us to file the annulment tomorrow morning, and I want us to walk into the same courthouse 2 weeks later, and I want us to marry each other again in the presence of 2 witnesses who know exactly what we are doing. Because I want you to be my wife in the version of the marriage that I choose, not in the version I inherited from a contract with your sister." I looked at her. I said, "You are asking me to marry you a second time, 2 weeks from now, at the same courthouse, in front of Margrethe and Cass." She said, "Yes." I said, "Solene." She said, "You do not have to say yes." I said, "Yes." She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes. Ask me tomorrow. Ask me the next day. Ask me every day for the next 2 weeks. My answer is going to be the same one." She said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." She looked at me for a long moment. In the 14th floor apartment in the late afternoon light of a Wednesday in December, with the paperwork for our first annulment on the desk, and the plan for our second wedding in front of us, the version of the 11 weeks we had spent not doing this was, in that specific moment, the version of the past that made the present possible. The annulment filed the next morning. Margaretha called Solene at 9:40 to confirm. Solene told her about the plan for the second wedding. Margarethe said, "I told Cass in October you were going to do something like this. We had a mutual observation." Solene said, "Same courthouse, 2 weeks from Wednesday. Judge Whitfield if she is available." Margaretha said, "I will book it." We were remarried in the same witness prep room where we had first spoken to each other. Judge Whitfield performed the ceremony. She said the same words. There was, this time, one difference. When she asked whether either party had any impediment to the marriage they were entering, I looked at Solene, and Solene looked at me, and neither of us looked away. Margarethe cried a little. She did not admit to it. Cass brought a small bouquet of eucalyptus from her mother's garden and handed it to me at the end. She said, "Congratulations, Reeve. This is going to be a great story someday." I said, "It is already a great story." We walked out of the courthouse into the December afternoon. Solene held my hand. Not because there was anyone to perform for, because it was cold, and she was holding my hand. On the steps of the courthouse, right where I had been walking up when the phone had buzzed against my palm 3 months ago, Solene stopped. She said, "I want a picture." I said, "To send to your mother." She said, "To send to my grandmother." I said, "Solene." She said, "She would have wanted to see it, even the version of it that came second." I said, "Especially the version that came second." She said, "Yes, that version." We took the picture. Cass took it. Solene held the small bouquet of eucalyptus in one hand and my hand in the other. Behind us, the same tinted glass door I had walked through on the first Tuesday of September, when a woman in a navy suit was standing at the security desk waiting for a sister who was not coming, and when a version of my life had walked in the door instead. The foundation is doing well. The Marchetti Family Foundation for Pediatric Oncology Research funded 4 new grants last quarter. 2 of the grants that were on the verge of publishing when Solene was still fighting to keep the foundation alive have published, and the survival rate for the specific pediatric cancer they were studying is now, in the specific quiet language of medical statistics, meaningfully improved. Marius has, on the advice of his attorney, ceased challenging the will. His attorney called Margaretha 6 weeks after our lunch and said, off the record, that Elise had watched me at that lunch and had told Marius on the drive back to the office that she was not going to build a case around the argument that our marriage was not real, because she had believed me when I had said what I had said about the difference between falling in love and knowing. Vera came to the second wedding. She stood in the back of the witness prep room. She did not cry, she did smile. Once, when I looked at her during the vows. On the courthouse steps afterward, she hugged me for a very long time. She said, "You were right." I said, "About what?" She said, "About her. I did not fall for her because I could not have handled her. You could. That is not a compliment to me. That is a diagnosis." I said, "Vera." She said, I know how I am saying it." She kissed me on the cheek. She walked to her car. That night, at home, in the apartment I now shared with my wife, not as a legal arrangement, but as the specific version of the marriage that was going to be the actual marriage, Celine stood at the window with a glass of water. She was looking at the city. She was in the same soft cream-colored sweater she had worn on the first night. She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes." She said, "Come here." I went to the window. I stood next to her. She put her hand at the small of my back. This time it was not for a photograph. It was because she wanted to. She said, "We did this." I said, "We did." She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Celine, you have asked me this question in some form 19 times since December. My answer has not changed. My answer is not going to change. And I am telling you that the next time you ask me, I am going to have Margaretha draft a legal document declaring you contractually prohibited from asking it again." She almost smiled. She said, "You would draft an actual document." I said, "I would have Margaretha draft it. She has cried once already at our wedding. She owes me." She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh in the specific way she was laughing then. Unguarded. Not for anyone else. Just for the room and for me, and for the small, quiet space between the two of us at the window on the 14th floor of a building where we lived. She said, "Reeve." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am glad you walked in." I said, "So am I." We stood at the window for a long time. The city moved through its evening. Somewhere across the city, my sister was probably sitting on her couch thinking about what she had done and had not done. And on the sill beside us, the peace lily was doing what the peace lily was doing, which was living, because I had told it what it needed, and it had trusted me. Celine turned her head to look at me. She said, "I have loved you since October." I said, "You told me." She said, "I am telling you again." I said, "Okay." She said, "I am going to tell you again tomorrow." I said, "Okay." She said, "I am going to tell you again the next day." I said, "Celine." She said, "Yes." I said, "Please do." She smiled. She rested her head against my shoulder. The city hummed. The apartment was warm. And the specific version of the story that had begun on a Tuesday in September, when a text had arrived on the courthouse steps and a woman I had never met had been standing at a security desk with a manila envelope and a set of stakes I had not been prepared for, was, at that particular moment, on that particular evening, in a 14th floor apartment with a peace lily on the sill, the version of the story that had turned out to be worth every minute of the wait.